Hi, it's Dr. Steve from Misericordia University. As we prepare to finalize our APA formatted research paper, let's take a quick review of the paper writing process, and then let's look at how to create the introduction and the conclusion. Just a reminder that our course paper should have approximately 8 pages in total. And I say approximately because in your body we're asking for 5 pages in the double-spaced typed body, and you could exceed that if you wanted to for the purposes of this assignment. But 8 pages total otherwise: a title page, an abstract page, 5 pages in the body, and finally your reference page, also known as bibliography. We're going to divide the paper into sections according to the outline. I'll remind you of that in a moment. And we're asking you to use at least 5 professionally respected sources. And in class we talked about using more than 5, because that way you'll have a whole lot more to write about. And I do ask that at least 3 of those sources, if not all of them, come from EBSCOhost. Remember to begin by typing your headings from your outline right into the paper. All papers will have an introduction and a conclusion. Now remember that the latest version of APA suggests that we don't actually type the word introduction, that it's understood, and instead of that we're going to type the title of the paper on the first page of the body and skip putting the word introduction. And then in my paper that I demoed during class, I had some other headings that came right from the literature as I reviewed it. And I found that there were a number of articles talking about what is distance learning, and it has different aspects to it. So I said, this is a theme, I'm going to use that as one of the headings. What is distance learning? And I'll define it. Advantages of distance learning, disadvantages of distance learning. I could put in a discussion section if I want to talk about and include my own personal experience with distance learning, and then finally a conclusion. So start by typing your outline into the paper template. We spent time in class looking at my analogy of writing a research paper is like being a lawyer in a court case. So the first thing we have to do as a lawyer is we have to frame the topic as a court case. In other words, what we need to do is not be general or generic, like my paper is about assistive technology, but rather pose a question. Ask something like, does assistive technology benefit students with special needs in the classroom? Can assistive technology help students? Something where it's a yes-no question. And this is important because when you create the title, that will drive your research and the way that you're going to prepare the paper. As you write the paper, remember that you're presenting evidence to substantiate your points. You're trying to prove your case. So when we write an APA formatted collegiate level research paper, that's what we're doing. We're trying to prove something. So as you write the paper, you're going to be making a point. For example, distance learning can be a cost-effective way of bringing in guest speakers. And then I'm going to have to back that up. I can't just make a claim without backing it up with some type of evidence, just like a lawyer does. Then I would go on and say something like Broskowski and Rogan argue, research suggests, or a particular author states. Remember that as you type the paper, you're going to be citing evidence, as I just pointed out. So don't focus on talking about your own opinions or your own feelings. Again, you have to back up every claim that you make. Remember that when you're writing the paper, you're not going to go to one article, for example, on distance learning, and find, well, this article said there are 5 advantages of distance learning, and Paul parrot them out. Because that really would be plagiarism, and it would be kind of just restating an existing article. Instead, like a lawyer does, we're going to formulate an argument. So I may read several articles, and I determine after reading those articles that there are 5 advantages or reasons to use distance learning and how it benefits education. So I will look at that, and I will determine from all these articles, and I will take specific points or statements out of various articles. So I may take 1 from this article, 2 points from that article, and so on. So ultimately, when I finish the paper, the argument will be mine, and I'm not Paul parroting anybody else, but I am using the work of other people to back that up. I build my own argument. As you write the paper, cite the evidence, and we cite it in 2 ways. For example, I can say one way that ed tech can enhance learning, and then I'll put the author's names and year of publication right in that sentence in parentheses. Another way is I can speak as if I know the authors. And I can say according to Bruskowski and McCann, and I'll still use parentheses and include the year of publication in there. There's a special rule from APA if you're citing more than 3 authors, because otherwise you end up, most of your paper is names of authors. So APA says the first time in the paper that you cite a work, be sure to include all the authors, no matter how many there are. And in some collegiate level papers, sometimes there are 12 authors. So APA says, yes, indeed, cite all of them. But in the future, if you're going to cite them more than once, and you probably will throughout that same paper, then just put the name of the first author and then use the et al., and that's Latin text that simply means there's more authors. It's like etc. So there are more authors, and we're not going to list them all in order to save space. But still, we'll put a comma and the year of publication. Now, let's look at the finishing touches on the paper. Let's consider how to develop the introduction and the conclusion. When you create an introduction, we're going to do basically 2 things in the introduction. Let's introduce the topic of the paper briefly, and then let's describe the general outline to be used in the paper. So this would be very similar if you were giving a speech or oral presentation. Introduce the topic of the paper to hook the reader, let them understand what that presentation is going to be all about, and then briefly describe in what order you're going to be discussing or what the points are of your outline. So let's look at a general pattern for doing the introduction. Now, you don't have to use my exact words, but in some way you have to make some introductory comments, and this can give you an idea how to approach that. Within a sentence or 2 in the first paragraph in the introduction, do something like this. State your topic and say, this topic is an important topic in education today. This topic refers to, and maybe describe it a little bit. Remember, we're trying to hook the reader and get their interest, but we also want to inform them what the topic is. Then, let's create a second paragraph that says something to the effect, in this paper, the author will examine and now go on to list the main points that are going to be covered in your paper. So usually, those are going to be the points from your outline, and they're the headings also that you're going to use in the paper. By doing this and following this type of pattern, notice that the material is highly organized. Also notice that I said in this paper, the author. Notice I'm referring to myself as the author. Always refer to yourself in an APA, formal APA research paper as the author, and don't say, I will examine. So let's look at how the introduction could look in the paper. I'll start off by saying, distance learning is an important technology in education today. It actually refers to and blah, 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 and I talk about it a little bit within one paragraph I describe it briefly. If employed well, distance learning can enhance the classroom. Remember that I'm trying, like a lawyer, I'm trying to prove my case. So already I'm setting up my case here so that the reader knows what I'm attempting to prove through this paper. Then in the second paragraph, I'm going to describe the outline. In this paper, the author, notice I'm not saying I, but referring to myself in third person, will begin by examining the technologies used, the advantages, the disadvantages, and some positive practices. That was my whole outline that I had projected that I would use. So notice my introduction is only 2 paragraphs. It's short. The majority of the typing will be in the rest of the body of the paper where I try to prove my case. Having created the introduction, now let's look at the conclusion. The conclusion is actually going to be very similar. We're going to start the conclusion of the paper by restating the topic and reviewing the main points, which sometimes refers to the headings or the pieces from the outline, and sometimes some of the key points that you have made throughout the paper to prove your case. So as for a starter, you might say something like, this paper explored, and whatever your topic is. In the paper, the author examined and then lists some of the main points, or again, sometimes some of the key bits of research that you have indicated. Then create a second paragraph and basically answer, did you prove your case? And then optionally you can answer some other questions like what will happen in the future? What's the future of the technology? Will this technology significantly impact education in the future? Is it going to be positive or negative? So you can talk about those kinds of things. The primary point of this conclusion is to start off by reminding the reader of what the paper was all about, very briefly, and then point out if you did prove your court case. And if you created the topic and focused it as a question, as we had indicated, then your answer is going to be either yes or no. Now, you don't have to state it in those words. Yes, I proved my court case. But what you may want to do is something to the effect that having considered all of the evidence that the author has presented, it is clear that, and now state that, like in my case, distance learning can be effective in the classroom. So that's our main point here. Take it home. This is like when you're watching lawyers on a lawyer show on TV or in a movie. It's the rousing conclusion that they draw that drives the point home. It's going to be the last thing that the lawyer gets to say before the judge and or the jury get to assess them or grade them in the case of a paper. So could the conclusion look? Here's an example. This paper explored distance learning and its use in K-12 classrooms. So very briefly, I've described what the whole paper was supposed to be about. In the paper, the author examined, and here I'm just listing some of those main points that we were covering throughout the paper. Then I would go on to describe if I have proved the case, and maybe say some extra words about maybe the future of the technology or what its implications are for education moving forward. Now that you've created the conclusion and the introduction, and notice we couldn't do those until we completed the whole body of the paper, now it's time to create the abstract. In terms of the abstract, we're going to create a 1-paragraph summary. And you've read these abstracts before. Some of them are lengthy, some of them are short in EBSCOhost. In EBSCOhost, you read the abstract and it gives you a little idea of what the paper is all about. Finally, we create a second paragraph and put the word keywords, colon, and then put a couple of search words that will feed into search engines. So if my paper is about distance learning, my keywords might include words such as distance learning, remote learning, mobile learning, and I'll put commas in between all of those. Now, after you create the paper and you add the conclusion, introduction, and abstract, now just reread and make sure that you have sound paragraphs. If you followed my method of writing, you took your notes and you copied and pasted notes under individual appropriate headings. Now, make sure that you've actually crafted them into paragraphs. So instead of individual notes, start off with a very good introductory sentence. So for example, if it's an advantages section, say something to the effect that there are many advantages to using distance learning in the classroom. For example, and then lead into your first note. Create a second paragraph and start something like this. A second advantage of distance learning is, and then go on to describe it a little bit. Create another paragraph. Another advantage is. If you write in this way, both using paragraphs and with the way you lead in to the different notes that you have pasted into these sections, your writing will be more highly organized, and it will lead to a much better paper. And finally, check to see if there are any holes in your paper, so to speak, or in your case. In other words, if I'm looking at proving that distance learning is helpful and beneficial in the classroom, I better make sure that I have enough advantages in there, because if my disadvantages outweigh the advantages, well, maybe I really, as a lawyer, have not done my job properly. See if I can put more information in, make sure that I'm able to prove my case. And if I can't, and if it seems a little skimpy with evidence, then just go out and get another article or draw more information out of the articles that you have already found. Remember that on my Help with APA page, I have a lot of resources, including the APA template and some helpful information about how to use APA and how to write a research paper. I also have a sample paper there, so you can learn by example by viewing that sample paper, and that may, because of its by example, it may answer a lot of the questions you may have. When you're ready, submit your paper electronically through Blackboard, and I will make comments, and I will return the comments along with the paper. I normally do a lot of comments to help you see how you can improve your writing. After you submit your first paper, and I'm going to say at this point I'm going to consider it a draft. I didn't say the word draft before this because many times people look at draft coupled with the word rough. Well, I'm not looking for a rough draft, because for some people, their first submission of the paper will be the final draft. Now, I will return the comments to you, and if it's not your final draft, then you have a chance to resubmit your final copy. And as always, I'm always available to talk to you and help you with any questions or problems that you may have. And don't forget about our Writing Center. They can be a big help as well. So much success in writing the course paper, and I look forward to seeing you at our next class.